The weekend of filming this video, it was hot as heck, like record-breaking hot, so I wanted to try and take advantage of this to make a home-brewed beer. The two things that came to mind are kettled sours and then fermenting with Good Belly yeast. So the plan was Friday evening to start with the mash, then boil, chill to about 90 degrees, and pitch some Good Belly for the lactobacillus that's inside of it and monitor the temperature over the next 36 hours. Then, after that time, boil it, kill any bacteria that had grown and soured the wort, add some hops, cool it back down to 90 degrees, and pitch the Voss Kveik yeast. I don't have AC in my house or a great way to temperature control my fermentation, but since I can monitor the temperature of the gigawort with the internal thermometer probe that's in there, I could adjust the heat if needed, and the residual heat of the house could keep warm enough. So, let's get started with the brew day. I'm aiming to make around a 1 gallon batch, as this is a trial run, so I'm going to start with 2 gallons of reverse osmosis water and add that into the kettle. And then I'm going to add some brewing salts with the targets and the amounts listed down below in the description. And now I want to keep the grain bill simple as possible, so I'm going to add a 50-50 mixture of Pilsner and white wheat malt, adding 1.5 pounds of each. Now, the homebrew store I went to doesn't double crush, so I wanted to try to do a step mash as a way to increase the overall brewhouse efficiency, and that started with 100 degrees for an acid rest. 3 pounds of grain went into my hop spider, but as you can see, the hop spider was too tall and not wide enough for the grains to be exposed to the right amount of water. So I tried recirculating it with a pot by draining out the bottom and rinsing the grains over the top, and the liquid did flow, but it wasn't getting the results I was hoping for. So after 10 minutes in that acid rest, I increased the mash to 120 degrees for 30 minutes. Also at this point, I decided to make the decision to remove the grains from the hop spider as it wasn't the right idea for this. So I pulled it out of the kettle, placed the grains into a mesh bag like I normally did, and I scooped out all the grains into that kettle and let it sit for 30 minutes. Then I kicked up the temperature to 150 degrees for 30 minutes for stratification and did a mash out at 168 for 10 minutes like I normally do. After the mash out, I pulled the grains and placed it over the kettle I own and did a mini sparge with about a liter of 170 degrees Fahrenheit water. And I squeezed and collect all the liquid to get around 2 gallons of wort before boiling it. I increased the temperature for a short 10-minute boil and added the wort chiller at this time to help sanitize it, and I cooled it down to 100 degrees. One of the methods I saw for kettle souring was to add lactic acid to drop the pH down between 4.1 and 4.3. And after taking a pH reading, mine read 4.32. That same article recommended Good Belly as a source of lactobacillus, and based on the cell count in a 1-quart bottle that I got from the store, it should be enough for 10 gallons of wort. So for around 2-ish gallons in my kettle at this time, I added 0.8 cups of the Good Belly. I gave it a brief mix and placed the lid on top and purged it with some CO2 from my CO2 tank. I sealed the kettle with some plastic wrap and set it in the hottest room in my house for the next 36 hours. Also for kettle souring, it's recommended to keep the original gravity to be no more than 1040, so my target was 1.030, but the step mash increased my efficiency enough to get me all the way up to 1.040, right on the dot. So 36 hours later, I removed the plastic wrap and took a look inside, and as you can see, there's zero bacterial growth. I took a sample for a pH reading to get 4.68. And I'm like, what? Why did the pH go up? So now this is Sunday morning, and needing to have this beer in the fermenter by that evening, the only thing I could think of to obtain a kettle sour at this point. I began by adding lactic acid to the wort to drop it down below 4.3 again. Then I added 1 cup of fresh Good Belly to the wort to try to kettle sour it, and I purged again the headspace with some CO2 and wrapped it up with the same plastic wrap and let it sit for 8 hours. Coming back 8 hours later to get a sample reading, it was only at 4.1, which I think is within the error of this pocket pH meter. And even tasting it, it didn't taste very sour. It wasn't tart or anything like that. So I decided to heat it up to a boil to kill off anything that had gotten into it. And at the start of that boil, I added a half an ounce of lemon drop hops. Then at flame out, I added the second half ounce of that lemon drop and chilled the wort down between 86 to 90 degrees Fahrenheit. One trick I learned from watching Homebrew for Life is that pouring the wort over a sanitized mesh sieve filters out the hops and any other solid matter that drops in the bottom of the kettle. It also helps aerate the wort at the same time when you're placing it into that fermentation bucket. After everything I went through this weekend, I got 1.4 gallons into the fermenter. Because the house is so hot and I don't really have great fermentation control, the choice yeast for this was the Voss Kveik, as it ferments extremely quickly and extremely cleanly at very high temperatures. And it being nearly 88 degrees in my house, it made it a no-brainer in this choosing. I pitched about half the packet before sealing it up, and add the airlock on top to set it aside for fermentation. The last thing to do was get an original gravity reading, which was 1.046, which is a little bit higher than I wanted, but I think that'll be fine for this beer. Now, as I said, this yeast ferments extremely fast. And before I went to bed that evening, it already started to bubble away and show airlock activity. So I let it ferment away for about 48 hours before I took a sample to get a gravity reading, which was about 5 Brix or 1.004. This means for me that it was time to add some fruit. I'd weighed out about 500 grams or 1.1 pounds of organic frozen mixed berries before and let them completely defrost from the day before. I then added them into a mesh bag with a fermentation weight, and to make sure things were all sanitized, I boiled both the bag and the weight before placing them in Star San. And then I placed the fruit inside the fermenter and added any juices that had escaped the bag. Place the lid back on top and purge it with some CO2 to kind of keep any air out, and adding the airlock after that. I did see minor airlock activity after adding the fruit, and after 4 days with the fruit in the fermenter, I decided to keg the beer. Before kegging, I pulled a sample for a final gravity reading, which showed the beer had a lovely hazy reddish pink hue, and the final gravity after all that was 1.008, which makes this beer around 5% ABV. Now, with all that said and all this trouble, let's go see if this beer was worth it in the end. All right, so here we have what we've been calling the not sour beer that I tried to make kettle souring using Good Belly. I want to start focusing on the positives first before we get into kind of the negatives of what I guess happened in the kettle souring process. So the positives is that the Kveik yeast, the Voss Kveik yeast specifically, worked amazingly. I fermented hot, so I only cooled it down to about 86 to 90 degrees, somewhere in that range. And when I pitched the yeast, fermentation took off, and it was pretty much done within 48 hours. It pretty much reached its terminal gravity. It was pretty clean at that point, very neutral because of the non-complex grain bill, and also the Voss Kveik yeast. One of its main characteristics is just being neutral, which is good when you're fermenting really hot to not have any weird off flavors. Then I added the fruit that was frozen into a kind of mesh bag with a weighted fermentation weight so that it would sit below the beer level, and let that go, and it was pretty much done fermenting, and I let it sit for, I think, 3 days, and then I kegged it up. So this beer from boil to actual serving was done in about 5 days, which is amazing, I mean, for any type of beer. Now, the color is awesome. It's this kind of pink, dark, almost like ruby grapefruit to raspberry color. The head retention is pretty good on it with the high amount of wheat malt that's being added to it. On the aroma, you get key strawberry, just fruity notes that are really, pronounced. They're very bright. That's kind of just what you get. Some of the fruit. The fruit just really carries over that I added. And the fruit kind of continues on the flavor. It's very fruit pronounced. It kind of matured every day that it's been in the keg. So when it first came in, it was pretty mild, but now that it's been sitting for conditioning for about a week in the keg, the fruit is very forward. It's very strong. It's nice. It has a little bit of tartness on the back end, which is definitely coming from those raspberries and strawberries that I added into it. And then also added blueberries and blackberries because it's just kind of a mix of berries added to it. So overall, I think if you just started from the brew day, after trying to do the whole kettle souring thing, from then forward, this is great. This is just a super crushable, summer beer that's very fruit forward. I would love to drink this next to a pool. It's only about 5% alcohol, so it's pretty easy to drink. I'll put the exact stats on the screen right now. But then I think coming back from that was all good. I mean, I would say if you're going to do this, Voss Kveik yeast works great, especially hot, and if you don't have any kind of way to control your temperature. And if your house is hot like mine was, mine got up to 88 in the day that I was fermenting this. So it did fine. It never had no off flavors because of that. So the last thing I'll say that was a positive was, I think, doing a step mash. So I started out and did 4 iterations of steps, really helped increase the overall brew house efficiency. I typically expect from the homebrew store that I buy from and their crush, the last few times I've done it, I've only really gotten about a 50% efficiency. And this time I got a lot higher, and I'll put the actual numbers on the screen right now because I don't remember them. But doing that step mash really helped increase the overall efficiency. And doing such a small batch, there wasn't really that much extra time. I think the mash time in total was maybe 90 minutes. And if you're thinking a normal, 60-minute mash with heating up water on top of that, it was basically very similar on my small scale. Then moving into the negatives, we'll start with the hop spider. The hop spider does not work as a way for doing a brew in a basket type of setup. It's just too small to the surface area of the kettle. I was hoping that it would work similar to like how you see the grain baskets like in the claw hammer system, but it's just not big enough. The pores are fine. It just needs to be a bigger diameter, I think, so that the water to grain ratio is a little bit more in the favor of the water than the grain. And then coming back to the kettle souring, I think that was kind of the biggest disappointment. It didn't kettle sour whatsoever. I'll link the article that I kind of followed down below, and basically it had said after you did your 10-minute boil to kind of kill anything, cool it down to the 90 to 110 range, and then add in the Good Belly because it has a lactobacillus in it, and it should kettle it within 36 hours. I didn't see any pH change. It did also say to drop the pH down to about 4.3 to 4.1. Some other articles I've researched since then said you don't need to do that. You can just keep it at whatever the beer pH is after the mash. So somewhere in the 5 range of 5.1 to 5.3. So it didn't kettle sour. I monitored it. I even pitched extra Good Belly into the kettle. I don't know what happened. I think next time if I try this, I will try a different strain of lactobacillus. That's maybe a pure lactobacillus. The homebrew store I went to didn't have it, so that's why I was trying the Good Belly, because that was commercially available I got it from Whole Foods. But I will say I think the gigawort could work as a brew kettle, especially if the house is very hot, because I could turn it on, I can monitor the temperature, and it would say it was in the 90 range. And if it got any little bit below that, I could turn on for a few minutes to kick up the temperature till it got to whatever range I wanted. So typically I was going to a max of like 110 and turned it off, and I could check it. And because my house was hot enough, because it was sitting in the 80s all weekend, it pretty much held the temperature and never really dropped below. I think the most it dropped was I cooled it down to 110 the first night on Friday. And when I came back the next morning on Saturday, it had only dropped to about 90 degrees. So that was only about a 20-degree drop, but that's still within the range that you want your lactobacillus to work in. So, the negative is that gigawort does kick off after 3.5 hours. It's not very precise in the lower ranges of temperature. So that's just kind of the negatives I've seen with the gigawort specifically. But I do think it could work in the future, and I'm definitely willing to try it again in the future. So overall, I think, if you take this beer in two halves, as we said, the Voss Kveik and the fruited part of it, if you just called this a fruited wheat beer and served this on tap, I've had beers very similar to this. If you try to say this is sour, there's no sour notes into it. None of the lactobacillus did any work. So I think trying a different strain of lactobacillus may help. I also think the last thing I'll say is that the pH meter I have is cheap. It's maybe $15 on Amazon. Maybe going up to a more expensive pH meter to have a better, more accurate pH reading may be the way to go in the future. So maybe that's what I'll try. But overall, this beer is super drinkable. I do like the end result. It's just not what I was expecting when I planned out my recipe. If you found any of this helpful and interesting, subscribe to my channel to see more content like this. If you have any tips on kettle souring that you've had success with, let me know down below in the comments, and I'm going to be sure to read those. And cheers. Happy summer.